everyone. Welcome to a webinar hosted by the Cloud Standards Customer Council, Public Cloud Service Agreements, What to Expect and What to Negotiate. My name is Tracy Berardi, and I'm Program Manager of the CSCC. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about CSAs, or Cloud Service Agreements. If you're new to the Cloud Council, I'll just take a quick moment here to tell you a bit about us and our work. The CSCC is an end-user advocacy group dedicated to accelerating cloud successful adoption and drilling down into the standards, security, and interoperability issues surrounding the transition to the cloud. The CSCC works with standards bodies, open source communities, cloud customers, analysts in this space, and we publish vendor-neutral guides on important cloud computing topics, such as the one we're talking about today, which has just been updated. Our work helps to influence standards of practice, and we highlight customer requirements to help inject these into the standards environment for cloud computing. So today I'm joined by my colleagues from the CSCC, Mr. Claude Boudois, Principal at Sebe IT and Knowledge Management, Mr. Mike Edwards, a Cloud Computing Standards Expert and Bluemix PaaS Evangelist at IBM, Mr. Long Wang, Researcher at IBM's TJ Watson Research Center, and Mr. John Brouillon, Business Cloud Broker with the Cloud Turbo. Moving on. Yep, there we go. So the CSCC has published a significant number of deliverables since its inception in 2011. We publish about a half dozen to a dozen different papers per year. In 2016, we've written a practical guide to hybrid cloud computing, a cloud reference architecture for the Internet of Things, and we're currently working on an update to our cloud security standards paper and a reference architecture for supporting e-commerce on cloud. So you're going to start seeing a number of version 2.0 publications as we're regularly updating the papers. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Claude so we can dig into public cloud service agreements, what to expect and what to negotiate, version 2. So thank you, Claude.
Thank you, Tracy, and welcome everyone. Good morning or good evening. So as you saw in the previous chart, one of our deliverables from this year, 2016, is an update to this white paper called Public Cloud Service Agreements, What to Expect and What to Negotiate. We first published this paper, version 1, in 2013, and we're basically now on a cycle of reconsidering every paper and every guide every 3 years. We determined that this is about the frequency at which there is enough new things that it warrants updates. Because the market has evolved and there's a certain number of cloud service providers, or CSPs, that have entered, and that changes the lay of the land. And even the service providers that we examined when we prepared version 1 3 years ago have made updates, in part because the customers have become more educated, have been requiring more or different terms in the cloud service agreement. So the nature and tone of some of the agreements has been evolving. Another reason why we updated this white paper is that hybrid clouds have become a lot more important since 3 years ago. And those hybrid clouds require special provisions in the service agreements to enable integrated management of multiple cloud services in a unified way, or to unify the management and therefore service levels, etc., between cloud services and the on-premises resources, the legacy in-house resources of the customer. Another reason is that data protection issues have become much more serious. We've seen that with the sort of fiasco about the EU-US issues regarding safe harbor. So now service agreements need to say something about how data is protected against access by the wrong jurisdiction or country. Similarly, data residency has become recognized as an issue even when it's not about privacy. And there are several other changes that we've made because we were lucky to have half a dozen new, very experienced, very knowledgeable co-authors for this revision, and they brought us some additional considerations that we included in this revision. So if you hold a copy of version 1, go ahead and delete it and download version 2. You will see the link again from the Cloud Council website so that you have our updated guidance. Basically, we start the white paper by exploring what is the landscape of a cloud service agreement, what is it composed of, and usually a CSA contains 4 different things. A customer agreement, which is sort of an umbrella sign at the bottom, on the bottom line type of document, and then an acceptable use policy that defines what the customer is supposed to do and not to do as they use the cloud service. A service level agreement, which goes into the details of what are the commitments from the provider and what are the remedies if those commitments are not made. And then privacy policies, what can and the provider do and not do with the privately identifiable information that the customer is going to share with the provider in the process of contracting the service. The language in the CSAs, the cloud service agreements, is usually spread between those 4 documents. And it is common that this language does not quite match, in the version at least initially proposed by the provider, the expectations that the customer may have. So that is why you cannot just close your eyes and sign on the bottom line. You have to scrutinize this language. And the whole purpose of the white paper is to help you do that, to help you parse, if you want, this language and understand what it is that you will find in there. Service levels are defined in different ways for infrastructure as a service, software as a service, platform as a service. And there are different levels of commitment, so you need to also be aware of what are the types of commitments you want depending what service models you are using. And there, of course, is less flexibility when you're buying a public cloud service, since the provider expects to be giving you one-size-fits-all terms. Nonetheless, we'll discuss at the end the fact that things may still be negotiable, hence the title of the paper. And large customers are going to have, of course, more power to negotiate better terms. On the other hand, the smaller customers are not totally without recourse or without help, because over time, if a larger customer demands and obtains certain changes in the terms, that will trickle down to all the customers of this particular cloud service provider. So the paper is structured in 10 steps, which are listed here. I'm not going to go into the detail of the steps now on this slide because we are going to spend time on each step following this slide. These are the same 10 steps that are contained in the Cloud Council practical guide to cloud service agreements, which is sort of, if you want, the parent paper of this white paper. We tend to have a practical guide series at the Cloud Council, and then we have white papers that dig deeper. This is the case here. So the same 10 steps will be found in the practical guide to cloud service agreements, which is listed at the bottom of this slide. And this paper totally parallels that and provides more detail about the specific language you can find and perhaps influence with your provider. So we're now going to go and review these 10 steps, And in order to start with the first several steps, I'm going to pass the microphone to my colleague Mike Edwards.
Thank you very much, Claude. So, yes, indeed, we start with the first of our 10 steps, and that's to understand the roles and responsibilities. Of course, when dealing with cloud computing, there are two major roles that we have to be concerned with. One is the cloud service customer, the person purchasing the services, and then we have the cloud service provider, who is providing the services, and then of course there may be sub-roles within each of those, but those are the two that we're going to care about most. And when looking at a cloud service agreement, one of the most important things that we need to look at in terming roles and responsibilities is likely to be the acceptable use policy. Now this one is typically there in almost all cloud service agreements. It's a significant artifact that you need to pay a lot of attention to, and it's going to contain a number of general areas, sometimes with different names. That's always something to watch out for. Terminology is not consistent between one provider and another, but they all cover these sort of areas. So first of all is content prohibitions. That means types of content that you may not put into the cloud service. And I think one of the concerns of the provider is typically to avoid illegal type content turning up inside their services. There are also then typically security prohibitions that relate to actions of the customer when using the service that might threaten the security of the service itself or potentially threaten the security of other customers who may be using the same service. So it's perfectly understandable why there would be prohibitions of that kind. There may be prohibitions relating to service integrity, to loading programs into the service that might interrupt the service in some way, cause integrity problems. And last but not least, there will be often prohibitions relating to the rights of others, typically intellectual property, for example, uploading material that is copyrighted by someone else, as an example. So there is almost always material of this kind. It's important to study it because the prohibitions, if violated, will typically allow the provider to suspend or even terminate the service. So a great difference for any user of the service to lose their access to it. So that then relates to the recommendations that we have. You need to exercise caution as a customer here and look very thoroughly at each provision that's there in the acceptable use policy. And you should hope that it's clear. Ideally, it's fairly brief. That it's complete, it does cover all the aspects of the service, and that is focused on the things that matter. So you need to spend a lot of time and energy looking at this before you sign anything. Now, that's the first step. So the next thing is to consider the business level policies that apply to the service. And here again, we've tried to give generalized language that you will find inside the cloud service agreement. Again, the wording used may be subtly different, but generally they cover a number of things. So there will be a set of data policies relating to how data that the customer enters into the service is handled. There will be policies relating to changes to the services, to the application programming interfaces, to the agreements themselves. There will often be policies relating to suspension of services. We've looked earlier about the acceptable use policy, no suspension if you violate one of those terms. There will be stuff relating to limitations of liability, and typically also in relation to intellectual property matters. So you need to read through the Cloud Service Agreement looking for these specific policies. And again, be wary, they may not be named quite in this way, but this is what they're about. So let's look at the recommendations that are included in the white paper relating to these 5 areas. Regarding data, one of the things that matters a lot to many customers is to be told what physical location or physical locations are going to be used to hold the content that's supplied. There may be 2 different aspects to that. One is that the customer may want deliberately to ensure that data is spread across multiple locations in case of a catastrophic failure at one of them. Or it may be the customer may be concerned that the data doesn't go outside a particular jurisdiction, particularly with personal data. That may be a regulatory matter, so you need to know where the data is being stored and that it doesn't go outside certain boundaries. Also, in relation to data, you should be looking for the provider to be making commitments that they are not going to be accessing the customer data unless required to by law for whatever reason. But really, the data should be treated as private and yours and should not be accessed by the provider other than strictly to provide the service. For example, if they're backing up the data, clearly they've got to take a copy of it and put it somewhere else. But they shouldn't be using it for any purposes of their own. Regarding to changes to the services, the APIs and any agreements, the main sort of thing you should be looking for is a commitment to giving you advance notice, ideally 30 days or possibly more. And where the changes take place, you should be looking for commitments to giving you backward compatibilities. In other words, the changes are not going to break any of the applications or processes that you've got that connect to the services. For suspension of services, the advice is to look for advance notice, ideally 30 days, to be given to you if suspension is going to happen. That not be given in the case of certain security type violations where the provider may feel the need to suspend immediately to protect their own interests. But in general, you should get advance notice. In general, once suspension occurs, there should be sufficient time to address whatever issue caused the suspension, and we suggest 60 days is what you should be looking for there. And certainly, you should be looking for clauses that say that the customer data that you've entered, in particular, will not be deleted just because the service gets suspended. You should at the very least be able to get the data back. Moving on to limitations of liability. Usually there are limitations of liability for indemnification or disclaimer clauses where actions are brought, for example, against the provider caused by actions of the customer. So there are clauses like that. They may be reciprocal. They may get actions against the customer caused by the provider, and there may be liability limitations there too. There will typically be intellectual property clauses, and one of the things you should be looking for is if a third party makes a claim of intellectual property violation to the provider, then the provider should really be notifying the customers that that's happened so that the customer can take action appropriately. So that's our second step, where we're looking at policies that turn up in the CSAs. So, to move on then to the third step. And that's the case where we're looking at differences caused by the type of service and deployment model that may be involved in the service that you're getting involved with. It's very common for the service agreement contents to vary depending on the service model in particular. So if we cover some of those, we'll start with infrastructure as service, where we're basically getting hold of a virtual machine maybe, or some storage, or setting up some networking. Now, because in this case the service is about basic hardware and support for those, the CSA is inevitably focused around that. And largely, the customer is ending up responsible for all the components that are going to run on the service. So your applications or your data, the operating systems you may install, database software, whatever. Ultimately, you, the customer, are going to be responsible for that. So you'll find, relatively speaking, the commitments being made to you in the CSA are going to be somewhat limited. So inevitably so. Moving on to platform as a service, where quite a lot of software now is also going to be provided to you by the provider to enable you to run your applications on top of that. One of the problems you run into with cloud service agreements for these sorts of services is to make a distinction between what capabilities are fundamentally part of the platform and which ones are not. So a classic example of that is there may be provided access to a whole variety of services that can be used by your applications. Some of them may belong to the platform itself, for example, the database. Others, such as the ability to go access social media or something like that, they may actually be simply pointing to services that are outside of the platform itself. And of course, you'll get totally different commitments in relation to those two very different kinds of capability. And something you need to be very clear on is that a catalog of the supported services that are there in the platform stack and that are being directly supported by the provider. Otherwise, you won't know what you're really dealing with. Moving on to the third service model, that's software as a service, and now you're getting a complete application provided to you by the provider. Now, in this case, you'd expect a more extensive cloud service agreement because it's got to address the end-to-end availability of all the aspects of the application. So the application itself, any middleware, databases and storage, compute stuff that it's using, security and network access, all of these things are really the responsibility of the provider for the software as a service offering. And so you should expect to see statements in the CSA that are going to cover these aspects and make sure that you have an understanding of what's being done. And often is the case if the software as a service offering is dealing with personal data, say it's an HR application or it's a health application, something that is most definitely involved with personally identifiable data, then you should see very careful privacy statements, privacy data protection policies that apply to that data, because you as the customer are the person, the organization that's liable for handling of the personal data. You want to make sure that when it's placed into the cloud service that it's going to be handled appropriately and that your responsibilities are going to be met. Okay, so much for step 3. I'd now like to move to step 4 and hand over back to Claude.
Mike, I was expecting you to do step 4.
Oh. Fine. I was just following my cheat sheet. Apologies. Okay, I'll happily do 4. So step 4 is to concern yourself with performance objectives that you have for the services that you're going to use. So there are a whole series of performance considerations that you may have in mind. And in many cases, you may find that the commitments that are made by the provider are somewhat limited. So we're going to look at performance goals, first of all, with 4 key components. There are the commitments that the provider is making to you as a customer. For example, how much availability, what level of availability of the service there will be. There will be about what will happen if the commitments are not met. For example, if availability falls below the target that's stated, and typically you get credits for the use of the service. In other words, you don't have to pay for a certain amount of the use of the service. There will have to be a credit process specified. How do you go about claiming the credit you think you're due? And often that is placed as an onus on the customer to notify the provider that the service commitment hasn't been met, and therefore they are due credits. They have to go then claim them. And last but not least, there are typically sets of exclusions which make statements that certain types of circumstance mean that credits will not be provided, and sort of act of God or force majeure situations where there's a major weather outages, things like that, may cause exclusions. The service commitments, generally speaking today, focus on availability, the uptime that's provided for the service. You need to be very wary about claims about availability, because although they may state the classic 99.99 or whatever percent availability is being claimed, you have to look very carefully about how that is being measured, what observation periods may apply, and whether there are particular exclusions, permitted downtime, sometimes called, that may apply. So it can be sometimes difficult to work out exactly what it is you're getting in terms of availability unless you look very carefully. So we talk about credits being compensation for missed service commitments, and again here you need to be cautious to understand the way in which service credits are calculated, and there are usually maximum limits to the amount of credit you can get to. You need to understand the process that is followed by you as the customer in order to get a credit. And again, there may be differences in the reporting time frame. You may have to do the report within a day or 2 days or a week, whatever, but they can vary. And the amount of information you're required to present to the provider can also vary. So our recommendations in the white paper is you must carefully analyze the commitments and the credits. You must understand the business impact to you as the customer of outages, in particular a single outage cost corresponding to the maximum downtime, because you wouldn't be able to claim a credit for that potentially, and yet it'll be impacting your business. You should look carefully at the calculations and the credit limits, and check out the credit process and whether your own processes fit in with that. Check the exclusions, make sure that you understand them, because you want to be surprised when you're using the service that a particular exclusion has happened. And you as a customer ideally need to automate the process for detecting and logging service outages. You don't have to rely on manual processes for that. Ideally you've got some kind of program that's tracking whether the system is available. When it isn't, it automatically logs it. You may find where there are APIs in particular that there are response time service level objectives as well. They're not so common today, but you are beginning to find services that do offer them, and those need to be taken into account very carefully as well, particularly where you've got programs running in-house that are connecting with these cloud services which are depending on those response times. And finally, SLA metrics, that's your measurements of the commitments that are being offered, are limited, and at the moment there are very few standards that relate to them, so you'll have to study the way in which the provider describes their material. Okay, having finished step 4, I will move on to step 5, and this time I will hand over to Claude.
Yes, and this time I am ready, Mike. Thank you for the handover. Step 5 is about security, privacy, and data residency. We actually have discussed among the co-authors that in the future, when we revise the practical guide to CSAs as well as this paper again, starting in a couple of years, we might actually need to separate this step into several steps, because there are distinct considerations about these 3 subtopics, but they are at the same time related. One of the big issues, if you want, around security, privacy, and data residency is, first of all, that people don't always understand or separate the 3 clearly. For example, data residency is not exactly the same thing as privacy, and there are issues of sovereign data that people tend to be less educated about, let's put it that way. The other thing is that because these subjects have emerged as very important considerations and concerns of the customers in the last few years, the language about those is not usually presented in a single well-identified place. The language is spread around several documents. Some of it is in the acceptable use policy, some of it is in a separate privacy policy, some of it is in the service level agreements, etc. The language also, definitely 3 years ago in the initial version of this paper, we told you, the users, that all the clauses we had seen were about the customer protecting the provider in terms of security and about all the bad things the provider could do to you in terms of service suspension if in some way or form the customer introduced security risks, and there were very few commitments the other way around. That has evolved a little bit, but that bias is still there. Most of the security clauses have been put in there by providers who are concerned about the impact that one customer could have on the service as a whole or on the security of other customers if they did something incorrect. So most of the terms are about what the customer can and cannot do. On the other hand, the main thing that we found lacking in general is that when there is a security breach against or at the cloud service provider, how is the customer notified, protected, and compensated for the impact of that security breach? And that's where you really want this to be well defined. You also, as a customer, would like to have some transparency about what measures the provider are taking to protect the service, to protect their servers, to protect your data. And if they submitted themselves to certain certifications or third-party audits, you want to see that information. You want the provider to make that readily available to you. If you are a customer who holds other people's data in your applications, you would like to know whether the provider is committed to protecting the information contained in that data. And that is not always, so that if you want, it's what we call the customer's data. And the terms listed in the customer service agreement are not always clear about that. And then we have this emerging issue of data residency. Where is the data going to be stored, and can you control where it is going to be stored? So the specific recommendations that we make about that is obviously that all these statements about these three subtopics should be explicit, that there are now a certain number of standards and certifications that the provider should follow and should make readily visible to you, that include a certain number of security practices that the provider should list as committing to observing them. There's a notification issue or several notification issues. If there's a breach, look for language that obligates the provider to notify you. If a law enforcement authority requires access to the data, you need to also look at whether the customer will notify you that the data has been delivered to a third party, although it is fair to say that the provider sometimes is obligated by these law enforcement demands to not tell the customers about the handing over of that data. So they may have their hands tied, but you need to look at what language determines this in the CSA. If there are security breaches or if the provider alleges that the customer has violated security, what are your recourses to resolve the issue without losing access to the service in case that accusation turns out to be misled or misinformed? And if a security breach results in some of your data being deleted or compromised, what measures is the provider obligating themselves to restore your data in a state as it was just prior to the breach. So what are their backup and restore mechanisms that they can exercise to make you whole again? And then the point we made about privacy of the customer's customer data, and what are the commitments about where the data is going to reside or not reside, and what are the mechanisms you as a customer are being given to specify which countries or your jurisdictions you require your data to be in or you require that your data not be in. So these are the set of recommendations about what to look for in that language. So moving on to step 6, which is about service management requirements. So the topic of service management has become a little bit more complex, in particular because of the hybrid cloud and the fact that most people, when they don't move everything to the cloud, they still have internal systems that need to be managed in a common framework. So, of course, a cloud customer must monitor and manage the cloud services they use. You cannot hand them over to the provider and close your eyes. The service agreements are not going to usually specify a whole lot about how you're going to monitor the service. This is something that is left up to the customer, who should therefore examine what tools the provider offers and what other tools you may need to procure and install yourself in order to monitor what's going on in the cloud as well as what's going on in your own infrastructure, and present a unified service management platform. And there is a list here of 6 sub-bullets that say what are the various aspects that a service management environment or platform should cover, from auditing to how are upgrades performed, how much notification do you get before an upgrade, etc. So the recommendations are, you need to understand your objectives first of all. What do you want to achieve by managing the service from your end? And then make sure that the provider gives you, in the language of the CSA, an adequate level of support in order to perform that management. What capabilities do they offer? What do you need to add in order to have a good grasp of how the various services are running? And in particular, there is this new type of software that has emerged on the market called cloud management platforms. And in a hybrid cloud situation in particular, if you're using multiple public clouds plus perhaps some remaining in-house infrastructure, those cloud management platforms can monitor everything and bring all this auditing, monitoring, reporting data back to you in a unified manner. And there is a certain number of other things you need to look for, such as what metrics are the provider going to provide to you on a regular basis or on demand, and what is the impact of each of these metrics on the fulfillment of your own business objectives, really. What is the maturity of the practices of the provider to meet these metrics? Do not abandon the management of the service totally to the provider, even if there's only one. You still need to manage something from your own end of the spectrum. So we're now going to move to step 7, which is about service failure management, disaster recovery, etc. And I'm passing the microphone to Long Wang.
Thank you, Claude, for your step. And step 7 is about preparing for service failure management. So in the traditional way, the service failures are usually managed by essential failure management systems. But in the public cloud services, then it may be a big challenging, especially if you are using multiple public cloud platforms. So actually, the public cloud service agreements usually have little about the service failure management. So that means the main burden on managing failures is on the customer himself. So customers then need to pay attention to what failures they care about and what are the impacts of different failures. And then as the review the service agreement shows, mostly the customer needs to identify the failures and also provide proof of the failures to the provider. Otherwise, then the customer may not get the compensation as they expected. So there are 3 key failure management systems that the customer may need to concern, because they are very closely related to the efficiency and the effectiveness of the failure management. So it includes the event management, the incident management, and the problem management. So the event management is usually provided by the public cloud environment to automate the handling of the failures or errors. So the public cloud may have some monitoring capabilities. They actually monitor the behavior of the infrastructure via, for example, SNMP or the application's workload if the application uses some common middleware. And then this kind of event will be monitored by the event management infrastructure provided by the public cloud. And then when there are some alertness or some thresholds of the failure detection is satisfied, then the automated handling of the failures will actually fix these problems. However, there are also some failures that that cannot be handled by the automated event management. So then this requires the customer to identify that there is a failure and also to report the failure to the service provider. So this involves like ticket generation, ticket assignment to administrators, or checking of the ticket resolution or so. So if the public cloud doesn't provide the ticketing or incident management systems for the customers, then maybe email is the last way to do that, which will bring a big outage of the service. So we want the customers of the public cloud to take care about whether the public cloud provides such infrastructures or capabilities. And the last one is the problem management. Problem management is particularly done by analyzing the recurring incidents in order to eliminate the incidents of the that repeats again and again, and also to minimize the impact of incidents that cannot be completely avoided. So customers should find out how whether a cloud service provider is employing an preemptive problem identification, and whether they try to bring some resolution techniques for it. So so to identify the 3 key failure management systems and understand how they will affect the performance of their workload with regard to the failure present behavior, this is the responsibility of the customer. The agreement doesn't actually cover this thing, and the compensation is just for the price. However, we all know that service credits or 1 more free month of the service doesn't actually really compensate for the criticality of your of the customer's business. So to understand how this service, how the failures impacts are, you should understand the three major metrics of failures. Is the mean time between failures, mean time to recover, mean time to and the mean time to failure. So mean time between failure means the time between two failures in the statistical, of course, in the statistical sense. Mean time to recover measures the time from the detection or from the manifestation of the failure and to the resolution of the failure. And the mean time to failure just means when the time from the normal running or starting of the workload to when the failure occurs. So these three numbers may not be in the SLA, but we recommend the customer to really ask for these numbers so that they can have a good evaluation of their workload failure behavior. Okay, and then the recommendation we want to give to the customers includes that first, we want the customers to ask for some interface for the event management and for the incident management. So this means the provider should offer some interface for sending failure and alert data. And also, we want the customers to ask for whether the provider offers the failure report interface. And then one thing is the expected time to resolution for service failure. This mainly is about the incident management. So we want to know whether the service provider actually have like 7 multiplied by 24-hour service on handling the tickets you generate. So this number will give you how your outage of your service will be when failure occurs, and then actually although the public service doesn't provide the resilience, doesn't provide the failure management in most clouds, but you are still able to support your provide your own resilience. And then you can do this by two ways. First, you can identify whether there are some resilience features already provided by the public cloud. For example, some geographically redundant storage of your data is already there, or for example, if there is some clustering capability, you can actually use. So first, you can use such built-in failure services provided by the cloud service. However, you should orchestrate them by writing your own tool. Or you can use the replication tool to copy your data from from your workload to some geographically or some other machines, not physically coexisting with the failed machine. Okay, so you should understand that these responsibilities and the handle of procedures, that means the orchestrations of this replication clustering and the using of these built-in features are all your responsibilities. And then you can actually provide your high availability solution. Another thing the customer may concern is the privacy of the data. So because usually the monitoring capabilities provided by the public cloud service is so because the monitoring is provided, so then you may need to actually check whether the monitoring actually violates your data privacy things. And the last one is to understand the mean time between failure, mean time to recovery, and the mean time to failure. Okay,
let's move a little bit faster, please, through the last few steps, because we would like to leave some time to collect Q&A at the end, and we're spending a little bit too much time right now on these steps.
Okay. So the disaster recovery actually is a specific type of failures, but it means the entire site may be down due to some disasters. So as in the step 7, actually the current SLAs of the public cloud services does not actually cover most of the disaster recovery and the business continuity things. Then actually you can see that in the SLA exclusions, disclaimers, and the limitations of liabilities, they actually show that the provider only have limited liability on the disaster recovery, and it's the customer's burden to actually design how to provide disaster recovery. So to provide disaster recovery, you need to, the most important thing, you need to figure out a recovery plan, disaster recovery plan. It includes the analysis of your workloads, prioritize which applications are important, which are less important, which services are not so important. And then you determine how long the downtime for individual applications or services are acceptable or affordable. And then you want to ensure the business critical content is installed redundantly in other geographical locations by using the replication or the public cloud's built-in capabilities, as I explained in the previous step. Two most important things about the disaster recovery is RPO and RTO. The RPO means how much data you can tolerate to be lost when a disaster occurs, and RTO means how much outage you can tolerate the service to be down when a disaster occurs. And then after you identify the RPO and RTO values for different services of yourself, and then you can decide the proper technology for providing the disaster recovery for different parts. And then, of course, the backup should be done in appropriate frequency, and also the data replication and applications by the cloud service you should understand for providing for creating your disaster recovery plan, and then and to implement the mechanism to properly detect the outages and quantify that. Okay, so I will hand over to the next step. John, it's your turn.
Yes, hello. The last two steps that we have provided in the document are quite touchy, because the first one is in regards to the governance, and because customers now are moving towards public cloud-based services for mission-critical services, and on the other hand, because public cloud services are quite standard in the way they're offered, well, there is a complicated issue of responsibilities and perspectives between the customer and the provider. And in fact, this chapter in the document is quite light, because the public CSAs today contain few provisions for customer-provider management processes. And the only formal channels of communication between the customer and provider specified in the service agreements are breach of contract clauses, sadly, like credit process or suspension or termination. And none of the agreements that we reviewed specify status meetings between the parties. So, I mean, this is an important part to consider and to try to find in the reporting, in the automated reporting, or in any formal communication channel with the public cloud provider for periodic assessments, service levels, compliance reports, problem reporting and status, change notification, request processing, or user satisfaction. And one thing to look really for is the escalation process up, for example, and including to the termination of service agreements. It's a really touchy subject to be looking into. So the recommendations we have there is to look out that the agreements are typically silent about communication and escalation processes. And so the potential areas for negotiations are regular status meetings, if obtainable, or a single point of contact designation. That's always a good element to have. Automatic notifications, to have them built in if they're not there, and to also try to build in to integrate APIs or web services to get these information. So maybe a step back here for public cloud services in the CSA. If there's legal requirements for reporting or data visibility, etc., maybe to take a step back, and that a public cloud service is not the right way for mission critical services or applications, and maybe a hybrid model or a private model with on-premises infrastructures and services is maybe the way to go forward. So if governance is important for you, please watch out for this aspect. The last step is, of course, the exit process, and that should and must be part of any CSA. So look for a formal exit plan with procedures, with provider assistance, what fees are implied, retrieval of the customer data. That's an important part, that your data are removed once you terminate the relationship. Now, after all, this is something that the public cloud provider should take into account, that this should be formalized, because cloud-based services are on-demand, scalable, on demand to go into cloud services, but also to get out of it. So that should be part of it. So do also look into having contingency plans for an alternative cloud service, which is similar or better, that you can switch over. Make sure that your data is where that you can back it up and you can extract it. And then insist that you have provider assistance to facilitate the extraction from the service. So just to make sure that we move on here and we can terminate the presentation. One last thing: there are some new developments. Work is taking place in the area of cloud service agreements over and above what we're presenting today. Have a look at the ISO 19086 and the EU Slalom project. Both are looking into standardized terminology for these CSAs, listing of many potential CSA items, and standardized metrics, which will be most beneficial. The codes of conduct and certification schemes continue to evolve. So if you see limitations in the CSAs you have, look at these additional sources of information, especially in the area of data protection. So no further ado, I'd like to hand over to Claude once again. Thanks.
Thank you, JB. Since we have only 2.5 minutes left nominally, and some of you have to leave probably at the top of the hour, please look at the box where you can submit questions. And if you have questions, type them in that box before you leave, so that we can collect those questions. We'll edit the answers into a document that we will post jointly with the presentation and other documents on this site, and we will inform you when that is done, so that you don't lose the ability to have a Q&A. And if you can stay on, we have a little bit of flexibility in time, not infinite. So in summary, don't sign these agreements blindly. They're complex. They're very important. They may limit you. They specify what the provider can and cannot do. So it is really important to understand what these documents contain. You don't have infinite ability to negotiate everything. Obviously, the providers do not want to have to provide a separate CSA to each individual customer, but there are some things that you can negotiate, potentially at the expense of paying more. So provider may be willing to give you some more commitments if you pay extra, and sometimes it's worth considering, depending on the impact of your business. Use this paper and use the various recommendation tables and boxes that you will find throughout the document in order to evaluate the CSAs that are proposed to you, especially when you're comparing multiple providers and you're trying to decide between them. Remember that you shouldn't really necessarily dream about getting a perfect CSA. Compare that to what your own private or in-house practice has been. You may debate whether 99.97% or 99.99% is what you're looking for in terms of availability, for example. But if your own availability in-house has been 99.5, maybe that fourth decimal is not as much important as the third one. So have a baseline about your current practice. Be careful about how service levels are measurements. Look at the paper to understand this issue of measurement time window, for instance, and what that tells you about what are potential traps there or things to be concerned about, at least, not necessarily traps. I didn't mean to imply the provider was setting a trap. Understand what the worst-case scenario might be and how you would recover from that worst-case scenario that would result in the services not being available. What is the provider telling you they will do for you? And remain in charge of the governance of all this. Don't abdicate your own responsibilities. Continue to have strong governance in-house. So that is the summary. So the call to action, I'm going a little bit over. Sorry for that. You can join the CSCC. It is free, and that will give you a voice in shaping the future documents and the revisions of the existing ones, and that will give you notice of what is the work in progress and the ability to look at this work in progress and to define the roadmap. You go to cloud-council.org and you will find the membership link, and it's again free and easy. After that, of course, the work starts, which means that then you can join one of the working groups corresponding to your interests and help shape the work. And then you will find on the Resource Hub of the Cloud Council all the documents we've produced so far, including the latest revision of every one. And that will obviously be your library of CSA guides and white papers that you can leverage. So with that, I want to thank the audience. If people are willing to stay a few more minutes, Tracy, do you have, and we have 1 minute and 50 seconds left now for the overrun. Is there one question that we received that you want to ask that we can take quickly?
Sure. We do have a question here about standards with cloud service agreements. What standards activities are taking place in this space? That might be something.
Mike Edwards, you have 1 minute 30 seconds.
Thank you, Claude. Yes, there's active work on standards for cloud service agreements taking place. It was briefly mentioned earlier, but there's the ISO 19086 standard. The first part of that will become available within 2 months. And that provides standardized terminology, standardized sets of cloud service level commitments or service level objectives that can be used in cloud service agreements. And hopefully that will help bring some consistency to different cloud service agreements and make it easier for customers to understand what they're getting.
Very good. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, all the other presenters, and thank you to the audience. If you have any questions that haven't been answered and you think about them later, I don't see any questions in the queue right now. Please send an email to tracie@omg.org. That's TRACIE @omg.org. And if we do receive some questions, Tracy will coordinate with us so that we produce a set of answers and we post them to the website, and we will inform you that we have done so. With that, I want to thank you for your patience and for your attention, and wish you good holidays and a good rest of the day to start with. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.